Page 74, if you've got the Tanya book. It's about a third of the way down the page. Chapter 17. Our big question for tonight is, could somebody lose their free choice? That's our big question. Is it possible for somebody to lose free choice? Okay, it may sound like a little bit of a frightening question, and there's a very specific reason that we're asking this question. So let's explore. How did we get here? How did we get to a conversation about free choice? Because this is the chapter that says anybody can do it. To develop a meaningful relationship with Hashem, to be able to have a love, even if it's a very primitive love, even if it's an undeveloped love. But every person is capable of developing just enough love of Hashem that will drive and motivate them to do the things that the Torah expects of us. How? How do you get there? Very important principle. And this is the principle that we've been speaking about, and we got very engaged in this principle last week. And that is that Hashem has designed us with a capacity that moyach shalit al halev betuldasoi. Now the word tuldasa is very important. We're going to come back to it again. It means that the mind rules the heart by nature. By nature is a very important part of this conversation, because very often people say, what do you want from me? This is me. This is how I am. I'm an impulsive person.
But the Torah does that not mean when you're born, like when?
That means your nature. It's your nature. The nature of every human being. From not from birth, because obviously when you're young you don't have the maturity for it. But the nature of people is that the mind controls the heart. Okay? The thing is that people don't believe this. And that's why we spin our wheels, and that's why we land up repeating negative behaviors and making poor decisions and being impulsive and just going with whatever the particular emotion is that happens to drive us at any particular time. Because we don't believe it. We don't believe that the mind has that power and authority over the heart. That we don't believe that we could focus ourselves and learn and meditate, and from that we'll actually end up having better behaviors. So as an axiom, it's a critically important part of how we understand ourselves, let alone how we understand Judaism or Torah or Hasidus or Tanya, just how we understand ourselves. It is critical to accept and realize and appreciate the power of being human, that we can use our minds to improve ourselves, radically improve ourselves, to completely revolutionize, to change direction, to rehash our personality, to fix our past, etc., etc. This is axiomatic to Judaism. If this were not the case, if the mind could not control the heart, there would be no free choice. The whole principle of free choice is I don't have to be a victim of my circumstances, or my personality, or my character, or my history. The whole notion of free choice says I can use this incredible tool that Hashem has given me, which is the human mind, as an asset, as a driver, as an opportunity to transcend, to develop, to grow, to regenerate, to recalibrate, whatever terms you want to use. Okay? That's where we left off last week. Now the question is, can a person lose free choice? Is that an option? Is that possible? Now, I know that immediately you're going to think, well, I could think of scenarios where a person loses free choice. God forbid that a person is, let's say, incapacitated medically. They no longer have the ability to make a free choice. A person who's lying on life support can no longer make a free choice. We're not talking about that kind of radical situation over here. This is not a question about can a person physiologically be in a position that they cannot operate their brain and therefore lose free choice. That's not what we're talking about. Is it possible that a person could, for example, intoxicate themselves to the extent that they don't know what they're doing and therefore they lose free choice? Is it possible that a person can drug themselves to the point that they lose control and they no longer have free choice? Yes, but it was a free choice to do that. The very important principle that we have in Judaism, and it's not an easy principle to swallow, but the principle says, that if a person begins a process by being negligent, but the end of the process lands up being accidental, they are liable for that process because they began with a negligent choice. So if in the intoxicated state I can no longer make meaningful decisions, I made the decision to get there. So I'm liable. That would not be an example of somebody who has lost free choice.
You can apply that thought process to anything
Yeah.
That where you've, like, you could say that if you were in a bad place and you got hijacked, that's because you chose to be there.
Ooh, okay. So that's a little different, right? Because let's say you could be in a so-called safe environment and end up becoming the victim of something which is outside of your choice.
But you chose to still be there. You could have been in another country. You
No,
could have
so
done
so
another
so
thing.
let's drill down.
Your security could have been better. You could have made choices to avoid that from
Correct.
happening.
So the Gemara says this. The Gemara says that a person who puts themselves into a dangerous environment cannot expect to have unique protection from that environment. In other words, a person makes a choice to go somewhere that is dangerous, they effectively, I don't want to say they're liable, but they effectively have endangered themselves. They have been negligent. That's exactly what we're talking about. That is a form of negligence. Now, how you determine what is considered negligence, that's beyond the scope of this year. To work out what that is. But that's a choice that a person makes, and absolutely they are responsible for that choice and the potential consequences of that choice. But again, like I said, that's beyond the scope of what we're discussing over here. What we're discussing is moral choices, and we're discussing personal growth choices. That's really what we're discussing over here. And we're saying that the foundation of any choice of self-improvement, of personal growth, of spirituality, any one of those choices is 100% in our hands. Why? Because the mind can control the heart. And therefore, we're able to direct ourselves, we're able to push back against our impulses, etc., and make good choices. Therefore, every person is able to arouse within themselves this basic love towards Hashem. How do you awaken it? By doing a meditative practice that allows you to think about Hashem's greatness and the value of having a relationship with Hashem. And that will already have an effect on how you believe, how you think, how you conduct yourself, and even how you feel. And by the way, if you think that this is far-fetched, try it. Because one thing that you'll see for certain is that if you train yourself to think about certain ideas, they will absolutely filter down into the sentiment that you have, the feeling that you have, the levels of impulsivity you have, etc., etc. We know this. We know this as a principle in life, that if you train your brain to think in a particular way, it starts to trickle down into other areas of your life. So that was really the principle that we spoke about last week. And we also said that even applies to somebody who is not a tzaddik. So just to remind ourselves, a tzaddik is on a very extreme, obviously on the high end of the spectrum, but a very extreme end of the spectrum, where the tzaddik is libam birashusam. Their hearts are in their control. Now, we just said moyach shalit al alev, that your mind can control your heart. What is the difference? Let's understand the difference because it'll be relevant to what we're going to speak about over here. There is a significant difference between the mind having the ability to control or rule the heart versus somebody whose heart is in their control. Now in English, you're not hearing the difference. But in Hebrew, these are very different expressions. Shalit implies that you have to sort of impose yourself. It implies force, right? Whereas reshus implies this is in your domain. It's in your, so to speak, jurisdiction. What's the difference? So let's use an example because it's going to be relevant just to help us build to where we're going this evening. Let's use an example. This is an example we have used previously in this Tanya share. All characters have been changed to protect the innocent. So there's a person who's walking in a shopping mall. This person, once upon a time, was not an observant Jew. Now they are an observant Jew. When they were not an observant Jew, happened to be that there was a particular restaurant chain that was their favorite restaurant chain. And this restaurant chain has a restaurant in this mall. So they're walking through the mall and they smell what was once their favorite dish. Is it correct to say, for this person, liboy birashusoi, that their heart is in their domain, in their jurisdiction? I'm deliberately avoiding the word control. What do I mean by that? What I mean is this simply. They walk past, they smell that food. The memories flood back. It's a highly nostalgic moment. We know that out of all the four senses, the one that stimulates nostalgia more than anything else is smell. Here's this person smelling that particular type of rib that comes from a particular type of creature that is not a creature that's on the based in list. Okay? So that's what they're smelling. Okay? That's what they're smelling. What's the heart's reaction? When I say the heart's reaction, what's the impulsive reaction that this person has?
To eat it.
Maybe not to eat it. That's maybe a bit
You
radical.
maybe want it.
To want to eat it. There's a difference, right? Not to eat it. They passed that. That ship has sailed. They've now been kosher for X amount of years. They're not going to eat it.
Crave it.
But to crave it. Oh, there you
Crave
go.
it.
To crave it, absolutely.
Crave it.
Absolutely, they could crave it. And they could do one of the following things. They could turn to their child who grew up in a completely kosher home and say, you have no idea
Yeah.
How good it was.
how good that particular dish was. Right?
Hopefully you don't.
Right? Or what they could do is they could say, with all this GM food that's out there and this lab-grown meat, I really hope one day they can lab produce something kosher that tastes exactly like that. Okay? So what does that tell you? Liboy, your impulsive self is not birishusoi, is not, so to speak, in the range of your choices of how to react. You don't get to choose how your impulsive side reacts. You do get to control what happens next. So here's a person walking past the restaurant. They smell their food. They go crazy. There's this nostalgic rush. They say, yes, but that was my past. This is no longer who I am. I don't do those things. I have a value system that I follow. I'm not going there. So, liboy is not birushusoi. Your heart is not in your domain. It doesn't live in the same domain as you. Rishus is a word that we use to reference domains when it comes to Shabbos. You have what's called a Rishus HaYochid, the private domain. You have Rishus HaRabim, which is the public domain. My heart does not automatically live in my domain. It lives in its own dream world. Here's another example. Ready? Another example. You're sitting at the Shabbos table. It's Friday night. You're sitting at the Shabbos table. Because it's a Shabbos table, there is a good chance that there's somebody at your Shabbos table who you would rather not have at the Shabbos table. But there's nothing you can do because it's the Shabbos table. And there's certain members of either the family or friends or community or whatever it might be who we, for whatever reason, have to have at our Shabbos table. So it could be that one strange aunt that you've got, or whatever. So they're sitting at the Shabbos table. And this is week in, week out. And they know exactly which button to press. So here you are, you're sitting at the Shabbos table, and you've got the children or the grandchildren or the nieces or the nephews or whoever it is that comes, and they go to a nice, good Jewish day school. And all you want is to have a little bit of a Shabbos experience with them, which includes, you're going to ask them, maybe they can share something about the weekly parasha. You're going to sing a Shabbos song. Maybe they'll sit on your lap at some point. You'll interact. They'll tell you about their week. You might tell them a story. And at exactly that point, right on cue, week after week, that particular favorite relative knows how to push the button, punkt, at exactly that moment. So here you are, you're about it, you want to call up the kid. This kid is, grade 1. They're so excited. It's the first year in their life. They came home with a little parasha book that's got all the little insights, and you're supposed to ask them the questions, and then if they know the questions, you make a whole rah-rah about it, whatever. As they're about to come up to do their shtick, this relative, right on cue, says, when are you going to stop brainwashing your children? Okay.
Oi.
So, where does the
You've
heart go?
experienced
Where
it.
does the heart go when somebody does that? Where does the heart go?
Anger.
Anger, frustration, disdain, resentment. It all bubbles up, right? Why? Because liboy is not birushusoi. My heart doesn't live in my domain of the Shabbos table. It's peaceful, it's quiet, it's inclusive, it's spiritual, it's meaningful. My heart's not there. My heart's in the how dare you offend me in my own home, in front of my children, about a value that I hold dear. Right? But then moyach shalit al halev. But then we get our head in the game and we say, you know what? I'm not going to respond. I'm going to bite my tongue, change the subject, steer the conversation in a different direction, or whatever the case might be. So do you see now what it means when we say that liboy birishusoi and moyach shalit al halev are not the same thing? Now let's say it was a tzaddik. The tzaddik walks past the restaurant. The restaurant's got this incredible smell. It's unbelievable. Never smelt good food like this in your life. The tzaddik walks past the restaurant. What's his reaction?
Zero.
Nothing. Liboy birishusoi. His heart lives in his world. There is no extraneous impulse. His heart lives in his world. He doesn't have to now rein himself in, control himself, focus, get his head in the game. He doesn't have to do any of that because there's no temptation in the first place. The tzaddik is sitting at the table when Auntie Hilda starts her whole thing about about your kids and how you're brainwashing them, whatever. The tzaddik doesn't get flustered. It's not like he's offended and then he has to ensure that he gives her an appropriate response. He's not offended. Your stuff, your issue. It's not something that I have to be worked up about. His heart lives in his world, which is focus and calm and connection and spiritual perspective. That's where he lives.
So does a real tzaddik never get angry?
Correct. Absolutely. It's very interesting you say that, because for those of us who are following the annual Rambam cycle, because you're supposed to learn the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, the 14 volumes in a year, so today's portion was about anger. In the Rambam's view, long before you get to a tzaddik, you should get to the point that you never get angry. Long before you get to tzaddik. So for sure, a tzaddik never gets angry. In the Rambam's view, ordinary people are supposed to reach the point that they don't get angry. Okay, so try that for size. Okay, so what have we got now? We've got two realities so far. We've got a reality where liboy birishusoi, where there's a person whose emotional makeup and impulsive side is completely on their side, completely aligned with all of their values and their connection and so on and so forth, and they're not fighting battles to stay the course. Then you've got somebody who's moyach shalit al halev. That's what we've been talking about, which is anybody can get their head in the game. With enough focus, with enough practice, with enough thought, with enough information, any person can get their head right. You do not have to be a tzaddik to have a focused mind. You do not have to be a tzaddik to have your intellect dictate your behavior. You don't need to be a tzaddik for that. You just need to be human. And therefore you can have free choice. Because as long as your mind can direct how things should flow, you can make a free choice. Our question tonight is, can somebody lose their free choice? Is that an option? Let's have a look. So on page 74, what's it, six or seven lines on top of the page, you can see there's a little full stop over there, and then there's an abbreviation just before that full stop. So we're straight after the abbreviation. The word is vehamoyach. Okay, if you're looking on the screen, it is, I'm just going to move it up so that it's the first line that you can see on the screen. Vehamoyach shalit b'tivoi v'toldosei al chol hasmoli shebelev. The nature of a human being is that your brain controls your heart. Not only your heart in the most general sense, but your heart, as we discussed in chapter 9, has two sides to it. There's what we call the right and the left-hand side of the heart. And the right-hand side is supposed to represent the part of the heart that is healthy emotions that are associated with what Hashem wants. So love of Hashem, love of your fellow Jew, love of the Torah, etc., etc. The left side of the heart, that is the impulsive side. That's the part that gets us into a lot of trouble. Even the left side of the heart is controlled by the brain. You remember that story of the insert the particular group that you tend to discriminate against, right? So yeah, it's the story of the blonde or the pole or the whatever, everybody's got their particular thing you put in, who's walking around constantly with headphones. And wherever they go, and it's socially awkward. You walk into a room, you've got the headphones on. Sit at the table to eat, you've got the headphones on. So eventually somebody gets really annoyed and rips off their headphones. And that's it. Falls down, kaput, ois, fertig, finished. So the person is very concerned, what happened over here? Takes the headphones and starts to listen, and hears on their headphones, keep beating, keep beating. It's like an instruction to the heart, keep beating, keep beating. Without the instruction, the heart doesn't know how to beat. In other words, the physiology of a human being is that the brain has to send the impulse to the heart to beat. And the physiology of the human being is a reflection of the structure of the human being and the spiritual makeup of the human being. So if it's the brain that tells the heart to beat, then that means that it's the mind, represented by the brain, that tells the emotions, represented by the heart, how to pulsate. Should you be fast-paced? Should you slow down? Should you be all worked up? Should you be stoic? That's what we're talking about, Amir. And that is natural. That is human nature. We're going to keep reiterating this. It's human nature that the mind should control the rest of us, the rest of our being. And if that is true for the heart, which is the world of emotions that can be so unpredictable and so impulsive and so easily inflamed, for sure, ve'al piv. For sure, then, your mind can control your mouth. And very often you hear people who say, oops.
They say,
I said that.
How many times before you say something?
Okay, but that's a method. That's a method. We're not talking about a method over here. We're talking about a structure. The structure of the human being. The structure of a human being is I don't have to say whatever comes to mind. The structure of a human being is I don't have to say it the minute I think it. The structure of a human being is I don't have to say it in that particular way. Any person who says, I can't help it, this is how I talk, we say that's nonsense. The brain controls not only the heart, but for sure the mouth. For sure can help us and guide us and ensure that we speak in a way that is gentle, that is kind, that is inclusive, that is warm, that is encouraging. And if that's true of the mouth, which for many, many people is essentially a loaded machine gun, va'al kol ho'evarim she'em klei ha'maaseh, that's definitely going to be the truth for any other part of the human physiology. There is no part of the human body that we can say, oops, that just happened independently of my brain. I don't know how that happened. Kids do that. Kids do that something. Oops, my hand slipped. When they slap their brother. Oops, my hand slipped. That's great when you're a kid. You can convince yourself of that reality. But as an adult, we realize that the brain is in control. So if I get my head right, if I get my head in the game, if my head is focused, everything else starts to fall in line. And that's exactly what the thrust of this chapter is about. We've got to get our heads right. We've got to spend time thinking about Hashem's greatness and about the value of having a relationship with Hashem, and then the dominoes will fall and the rest of us will align with what Hashem wants. But if we don't think about these things, how can we expect that we're going to mature, that we're going to grow, that we're going to transcend? With what tool? But there is an exception. What's the exception? Im loi mi shuhu rasha be'emes. The exception is a true rasha. Now we've just entered the controversy of could somebody lose their free choice? Okay, let's read on. Kamay Merazal, as the statement goes from our sages in the Midrash, where they say, Sheharishoim heim birashus libam. Wicked people, they are in the domain of their heart, they are in the jurisdiction of their hearts. Ve'ein libam birashusam klal. And they are completely incapable of controlling their hearts. That's a very, very powerful and concerning statement. Right? It's a very concerning statement.
So you've got there are obviously proper wicked people in this world, like rapists and
Okay, we'll get to who they are.
What about-
Well, let's not use such dramatic terms. You can
No,
get,
but there is
a person can
proper
get to be
Russian-
Russia MS before those
What
those levels.
What about if you've got like a chemical imbalance and you don't produce serotonin, or you've got too much cortisol and everything's off balance, so you go to a psychologist and then they get or a psychiatrist.
More
and
likely
they
a psychiatrist.
They medicate you and it balances things out and you become a better person just because you're more like aware and astute and
But
balanced.
did they make you a Russia in the first place?
I don't
Maybe
think
it
I
does.
don't
I
think you
think
can
so.
ever equate illness with
The Russia.
rishus, with evil. You can't. If a person is, and of course this is a very touchy subject because you need to have a clear professional medical diagnosis before you can declare somebody ill. But if somebody is ill, that's a different conversation to this. We're not talking about somebody who's ill. We're talking about somebody who has made toxic choices repeatedly and therefore allowed the heart to take control. Let's talk about this for a second. We live in a very interesting society as modern people living in a pseudo-Western country. And people who live in a true Western country have this problem more than we do. And one of the things about living in a Western democracy is that you'll notice there is a tremendously strong sense of entitlement.
Well,
So what does that mean?
Where have you been living?
What does that mean? What does it mean, an incredibly strong sense of entitlement? It means that people feel that what they feel is more relevant than what is either objectively true or what are the underpinnings of a healthy society. So, for example, you believe that law and order is negotiable, right? So therefore we can shoplift,
Right.
or therefore we could bribe, or therefore we could various forms of corruption, or stand up against law enforcement when they're enforcing the law, various things like that. So there's this tremendous sense of entitlement. That is not the same as illness. That is a particular, you can either call it upbringing or societal influence that has convinced people.
decay.
Yeah, correct. But decay is almost just, I'll tell you what the issue is with the word decay. It almost removes responsibility. Decay sounds like it's an organic process, whereas this is actually an intentional process. This is a process of cultivating people to believe in all these like these weird and wayward ideals and behaviors and so on and so forth. So if you want to take it to a much less dramatic example, a much less dramatic but equally valid example is the indulged child. So what happens to the child who's never been exposed to discipline? The child who's never heard the word no growing up. What's going to happen to that person?
Yeah.
What's going to happen is they won't know how to control their heart. In other words, they won't know how to control their impulse. Nobody ever taught them that. Nobody gave them those tools to be able to actually direct and control in a healthy way impulses.
There were no consequences.
Even without consequences, there were no
There
boundaries.
wouldn't be
I'm saying
no
even without
boundaries.
with no boundaries. If a person is brought up without boundaries, how can they be expected to mature to the point that they realize, I need to take personal responsibility and I need to learn methods to be a better human, a more disciplined human, a more appropriate human, etc. So that may not be as dramatic as Russia MS, but it illustrates a point. It illustrates a point. We're going to get to that point in one moment. It illustrates a point that it is possible for a person to, and now I'm going to borrow your word, to decay to the extent that they no longer have the natural control a human should have. Now I want to ask you a question. Would you agree that if a person took an item from another person against their will, would you agree that that's a crime?
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
crime, right? And would you agree that if a person took an opportunity that was due to somebody else, that would be perhaps not a prosecutable crime, but it would be a terrible thing to do to a person, right? So for example, let's say that somebody had a great idea and they had an opportunity to turn that idea into a business, and somebody else swooped down, stole the idea, and this person hadn't registered any trademarks or copyrights or anything like that, but somebody else went and started that same business. While you may not be able to prosecute them in a court of law, it's a terrible way to behave, right? We'd all acknowledge that.
Yeah.
So if that's true, what do you think the level of crime is to take away from somebody the ability to recognize their own power? It's got to be one of the worst things you can ever do to a person. So when you say take away somebody's power, you immediately think about abuse. You might think about hostages. You might think about taking a segment of the population and discriminating against them and stripping them of their rights. That's usually what we think of when we say take away somebody's ability to experience or to express their power. But if you tell a person you don't have to be disciplined, you don't have to use your mind to work it out, to become better, that's a terrible theft. It's a very deep theft. You can't return it afterwards. You know, if somebody steals your pen, they can return your pen. If they steal your car, they can return your car. If they steal your money, they can repay your money. But if they steal from you your ability to be what an optimum human is supposed to be, that's one of the worst things you could ever do to a person. Reducing them effectively to an impulsive creature, which basically is like an animal. The greatest distinction between humans and animals is that humans have the ability not to live on impulse. Humans have the ability to, use an expression, curb their enthusiasm. Right? They have the ability to direct themselves, to make choices, to do hard things. Imagine stealing that from somebody. Imagine stealing that from a generation. That is criminal. What we're learning over here is, like any other muscle in the human environment, if you don't work the muscle, don't expect the muscle to work. If you don't train it, if you don't challenge it, if you don't give it some resistance to push back against, if you don't create scenarios where it will be tested, how can that muscle be functional? What's a Rasha be'emes that we're talking about over here? What does that mean, a Rasha be'emes? A true Rasha. Sounds like an oxymoron. How can you use the word true and wicked in the same sense? It's like when people use the expression pure evil. It's a great oxymoron. Pure and evil, what have they got to do with each other? Pure and evil are opposites. How can you use the word true and Rasha all together? Because this is what we mean. We mean that we've already learnt all the way back in chapter 11 that most of us fall into the category of Rasha. Because by the Tanya's definition, a Rasha is not a criminal, is not a pedophile, is not a scammer, pyramid scheme, Ponzi personality. By the definition of Tanya, a Rasha is a person who is misaligned with Hashem, even if it's infrequent, even if it's minor. Because a Beinoni is somebody who never misaligns, who never steps out of sync with Hashem. A Beinoni.
Isn't that a medium?
Correct. And that's the whole thesis of what Tanya has taught us up until this point, is that the Beinoni is the optimum version of the average man. That's why Beinoni is the average man. The optimum version of the average man is to have self-control. So the average man who does not yet have self-control, which is the vast majority of humans, that's a Rasha. But it's not a Rasha be'emes. That's not a Rasha in the way that it drips with negativity. You know, when you say to somebody, they are a Rasha, usually you mean that as a terrible insult. The average person is not a Rasha be'emes. They're not truly a Rasha. They're just misaligned with Hashem. What does truly a Rasha mean?
Never aligned.
You choose it.
Correct. Never aligned. And
You choose not to.
they choose. not to be
choose
aligned. See the difference?
But the choose is still the brain.
We choose to be aligned and then we fail along the way. This is someone who chooses not to be aligned. Very different.
But they're still using the brain to choose.
We're going to see. I'm not sure if that's true. I'm not sure if that's true. We'll see.
Do they? Is choice really a
don't
thing?
know.
'Cause, we've had this conversation before, but what about what's ordained versus what's choice?
Your spiritual status is never ordained.
Okay.
Your spiritual status is never ordained. Every single one of us could become the greatest of the great.
But God knows what you're going to do.
That's different to ordained.
Okay, fine. Wrong word.
Okay? That's definitely the wrong word. Because if I know, for argument's sake, that the bus is going to arrive at 8 p.m., that doesn't make the bus arrive at 8 p.m. Right? Foreknowledge of something is not causation of that thing. Okay? So the fact that Hashem knows how the story is going to end is not what made me go down that path. It's just because Hashem knows me so well. Right? But my choices are absolutely my choices. Okay, so let's come back. So what's the difference between a Russia typical, which, welcome to the club, versus a Russia be'emes, who is like a real rogue? The difference is that the regular Russia usually wants to do what Hashem wants, but from time to time, or very often, temptation gets the better of them. The Yetzer Hara gets the better of them, whichever term you want to use.
Is the Yetzer Hara your heart?
No. Your Yetzer Hara is an influence on the heart. The heart is an emotional being. Emotions are neutral. They do not have to be positive or negative. And then there are two Yetzers, there are two inclinations that drag the heart in one or the other direction. So the Yetzer Hara is the part that kind of drags our heart to negative emotion, and the Yetzer Tov to positive emotion. But the Yetzer Hara is not the heart itself. So that's why the verse says, Yetzer Leiv Ha'adam Ra Mini Urav. The inclination of the heart of man is primarily towards inappropriate things, right? Towards evil. But it's the inclination of the heart. So what happens over here? If a person chooses to become a Rasha be'emes, that choice is not an intellectual choice. That choice is a reckless choice. There's a very big difference. Let's go back to our example. The person who gets completely intoxicated, and as a result of that, they do things for which they don't want to be held accountable because they say, I wasn't thinking at the time, I wasn't aware at the time. We'll say, that's all true, but you got there by making a reckless choice. The reckless choice was to be paralytic, or to have so much alcohol in such a short period of time. Now, nobody uses their brain to decide, today, on my agenda is take my car for a service, pick up my dry cleaning, get completely paralytic, right? That's not an intellectual.
You're gonna argue this.
That is not an intellectual choice. That is a reckless choice. If the brain was making that choice, the brain always makes a decision based on analysis and choosing what appears to be the best course of action.
Unless it's addiction.
So addiction is not the brain. Exactly. To the point. Exactly. So there is that is exactly what Rasha Be'emes is. Rasha Be'emes is somebody who's allowed themselves to become reckless. I don't mean reckless necessarily in self-harm, not reckless necessarily in crazy negligent behavior, but reckless to the extent that they've allowed either temptation or anger or envy or any of the vices of the human being to become the guiding force in their life, and they have allowed themselves not to think otherwise. Therefore, it's only a natural consequence that if you don't create boundaries, eventually you cannot have boundaries. If you don't create meaning, eventually you cannot appreciate meaning. That's how we are as human beings. Whatever course of action we repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat, eventually the synapses are built in that particular way, and that is how we operate. Now, there is no such thing as a person who's too far gone and can never pull themselves back. That's coming later in the chapter. But right now, we're just analyzing how a person got into such a bad place. Two questions on the Zoom. The one question is, you are a Rasha in both cases? Yes, that's because Rasha is purely an identifier of where you are on your spiritual journey. However, already in chapter 11, we made a very important distinction between what's called Rasha vera loi, a rasha for who things are bad. Now we can rephrase that. A rasha for whom prospects are bad, because they are headed in such a bad direction. The trajectory is just darker and lower and more mired in their nonsense. Versus rasha vetoivloi, a person who's in an unhealthy place, but they're on a good wicket. They're headed in the right direction. You know, it reminds me a lot of this. Anybody who knows South African Jews will know that we are a rare community, because in the South African Jewish community, you have people who drive to shul on Shabbos and call themselves Orthodox. In the rest of the world, you could not call yourself Orthodox if you drive to shul. So, what's the difference between the person who drives to shul and calls themselves Orthodox and the person who drives to shul and parks next to the rabbi who drove to shul? The difference is that the one is saying, I know this is wrong, but I aspire to something better. That's why I'm driving to shul, wanting to be considered part of the Jewish experience. Whereas the other is saying, who says there's anything wrong with driving to shul? So the Rosh Hashanah says, who says there's anything wrong with my behavior? I like the way I live. Who are you to judge me? Who are you to tell me otherwise? I feel that this is healthy. I feel that this is pleasurable, if not healthy. That's what I want. Next question was, what about planned suicide? So is planned suicide a rational rasha choice? Because our argument is that a person doesn't make a rational rasha choice, right? If the brain was working, then we'd be making healthy choices. Well, one of the things we're going to learn about, I don't know if we're going to get the opportunity to learn about it, but one of the things that emerges from this rasha be'emes scenario, and I'm not saying that a person who chooses planned suicide is a rasha be'emes, but the concept is that it is possible for a human being to get so caught up in an unhealthy behavior that the brain also now follows an unhealthy way of thinking. So, in other words, if a person doesn't have the Jewish value of life and the holiness of life and our responsibility to the one who gave us life, if you don't have those clear principles, then the mind could go down it's now popular that a person can choose to commit suicide if life is getting too painful. So this is not a judgment, it's just explaining how a person can make a misaligned decision, even so-called using the mind. It deserves a lot more conversation than what we can do now. So here's what the Alter Rebbe says. V'zeh oynesh al goydel v'oitzem avoinam. The rasha be'emes, who cannot control the heart is wild, it's a punishment. Why does it say it's a punishment? Because the nature of humans is that the mind controls emotions. When you discover that there's a person who cannot control their emotions, and the emotions dictate everything about them, that is unnatural. In which case you have to ask, how did that happen? How could a person be so opposite to the way humans are designed? That, says the Alter Rebbe, is a punishment. Now we have precedent for this, and the precedent is in the form of Pharaoh. Because when the Torah tells us that Hashem hardens Pharaoh's heart, that's exactly what happened.
No, but that's what we're doing with Sarah Malka. Exactly.
Okay, so there you go. So that's exactly what happens. That's exactly what happens. What is hardening the heart? He behaves in a toxic way again and again and again and again to the detriment of millions of people. Eventually he loses the ability to have that rational guide to how he should behave, even in the face of self-destruction. That's rasha be'emes.
Apparently in the first 5 plagues, he sort of had that free choice.